The sun was barely showing above the horizon when Jake's diversion group rode away from the main camp. Besides Jake and Ayanna, the group included Kosin and 4 other young Apache warriors who volunteered for the dangerous mission. Their job was to create a trail so obvious that Chadow's warriors could not miss it, leading them away from the families heading toward Jake's ranch. They rode hard toward the southeast, deliberately breaking branches, disturbing rocks, and leaving clear hoofprints in the soft ground near waterholes. Jake hoped this false trail would buy the main group enough time to reach his ranch safely. After 2 hours of hard riding, they stopped at a small hill where they could look back across the desert. In the distance, they could see the dust cloud. That meant Chadow's warriors were following their trail. The plan was working. "How far to your ranch from here?" Kosin asked Jake. "Maybe 10 miles, Jake replied, pointing toward the northwest. "If we can keep Chadow busy for a few more hours, our people should make it there safely." Ayanna was studying the landscape ahead of them. "There," she said, pointing to a cluster of large rocks about a mile away. "Good place to make stand. They have to come at us from front. No way to surround us." Jake looked at the position she had chosen and nodded approvingly. It was exactly the kind of defensive position he would have selected. High ground, good cover, and limited approaches for enemies. They reached the rocks just as Chadow's warriors came into view behind them. Jake counted at least 25 men, all mounted and heavily armed. The odds were not good, but their position gave them some advantage. "Remember," Jake told the group, "we don't have to defeat them. We just have to hold them here long enough for our people to reach safety." The Apache warriors nodded grimly. They had all accepted that this might be their last fight, but they were determined to make it count. Chadow's warriors spread out as they approached, trying to find ways to attack. They defended position from multiple directions, but Ayanna had chosen well. The rocks formed a natural fortress that could only be approached from the front. The first attack came within minutes. Half a dozen warriors charged up the slope toward their position, firing rifles and shooting arrows. Jake and his companions returned fire from behind the protective rocks, and their accurate shooting forced the attackers to retreat. But Jake knew this was only the beginning. Chadow was testing their defenses, learning about their weapons and numbers. The real attack would come soon. During the brief pause between attacks, Ayanna moved closer to Jake. "If we do not survive this," she said quietly, "I want you to know something." "We'll survive," Jake said firmly. "Maybe," she replied, "but if not, I want you to know that helping me was best thing that happened to me in long time. You show me that white man and Apache can trust each other." Jake looked into her dark eyes and felt his heart racing. "Ayanna, His words were cut off by shouts from Kosin. "They come again!" This time, Chadow's entire force was attacking. Warriors approached from 3 directions using the scattered rocks and bushes for cover. The firing was intense, and Jake could hear bullets whistling past his head and striking the rocks around him. One of their group, a young warrior named Naiche, cried out and fell backward with a bullet wound in his shoulder. Ayanna immediately crawled over to help him while Jake and the others continued firing at the attackers. The battle lasted for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes. When the smoke cleared, Chadow's warriors had again been forced to retreat, but not without cost. Naiche was seriously wounded, and their ammunition was running dangerously low. Jake knew they could not hold out much longer. But as he prepared for what might be their final stand, he heard something that made his heart leap with hope: the sound of horses approaching from the northwest. At first, he feared it might be more of Chadow's warriors coming to surround them. But as the riders came closer, Jake recognized the lead horseman. It was Bill Harrison, his nearest neighbor, leading a group of ranchers and cowboys. Behind Harrison came more riders. Other neighbors Jake recognized, and some he did not. But most surprising of all, mixed in with the white cowboys were Apache, warriors from Chief Nalnish's band. Somehow the 2 groups had joined together to come to Jake's rescue. The arrival of reinforcements changed everything. Chadow's warriors, who had been preparing for another attack on Jake's small group, suddenly found themselves outnumbered and caught between 2 forces. What followed was less a battle than a rout. Faced with overwhelming odds, most of Chadow's Warriors scattered and fled toward the mountains. A few tried to make a stand, but they were quickly overwhelmed. Chato himself was captured trying to escape on foot after his horse was shot. He stood defiant and proud even in defeat, refusing to show fear or ask for mercy. As the dust settled, Bill Harrison rode up to Jake's position. "You all right, Jake?" he called out. "We're fine, Bill," Jake replied, hardly believing what had just happened. "But how did you find us, and how did you end up working with the Apache?" Harrison grinned. "Well, that's quite a story. Chief Nalnish and his people showed up at your ranch about 2 hours ago. At first, some of the boys wanted to start shooting, but the chief had your letter." "My letter?" "The one you wrote explaining the situation," Harrison said. "One of the Apache boys who speaks English delivered it to me this morning. Once we understood what was happening, that these were peaceful Apache being attacked by the same hostiles who have been raiding our ranches, well, it seemed like we ought to help." Jake looked around at the mixed group of cowboys and Apache warriors who had come to their rescue. White men and Apache were talking together, sharing water, and helping tend to the wounded from both sides. It was something he had never thought he would see. Chief Nalnish rode up to where Jake and Ayana were standing. "My people are safe at your ranch," he reported. "Your neighbors have welcomed them and helped them settle in." "What happens now?" Jake asked. The chief dismounted and looked around at the scene. Chato's defeated warriors, the mixed group of rescuers, and the evidence of successful cooperation between two peoples who had been enemies. "Now," he said slowly, "I think we learn to be neighbors instead of enemies." Over the following weeks, Jake's ranch became the center of a remarkable experiment in cooperation. Chief Nalnish's people established a semi-permanent camp on Jake's land, helping with ranch work in exchange for protection and supplies. Some of the Apache men proved to be excellent cowboys, and some of Jake's neighbors began to appreciate their skills and knowledge. Not everyone was happy with the arrangement. Some white settlers remained suspicious of the Apache, and some Apache from other bands criticized Chief Nalnish for cooperating with white men. But the success of their partnership in defeating Chato's warriors had proven that cooperation was possible. As autumn turned to winter, Jake found his feelings for Ayana growing stronger. She had proven herself not just as a strong and capable woman, but as someone who shared his vision of a future where different peoples could live together in peace. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset from the porch of his ranch house, Jake finally found the courage to speak his heart. "Ayana," he said, "your grandmother said I might make a good husband for an Apache woman. What do you think?" She looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes that had captivated him from their first meeting. "I think," she said slowly, "that Jake Morrison might make good husband for this Apache woman." When they married the following spring, it was a ceremony that combined both Apache and white traditions. Chief Nalnish performed the Apache rituals while the local preacher added the Christian elements. Cowboys and Apache warriors celebrated together, and Jake's neighbors brought wedding gifts alongside Ayana's relatives. Their marriage became a symbol of what was possible when people chose cooperation over conflict, understanding over prejudice. Jake's ranch became known throughout the territory as a place where Apache and white families worked together, proving that two very different peoples could find common ground. Years later, when visitors asked Jake how it had all started, he would tell them about the day he saw a tall Apache woman standing up to 3 warriors who meant her harm. He would explain that sometimes the most important moment in a man's life comes when he chooses to help a stranger in trouble, not knowing where that choice will lead him. And Ayana would add that sometimes the greatest adventures begin when someone is willing to stand between danger and someone who needs protection, showing that courage and kindness can bridge any divide between peoples who are willing to try. The morning sun painted the Texas landscape in shades of gold and amber as Jake Morrison guided his horse along the winding path beside the Rio Grande. The year was 1887, and the frontier was still wild and untamed. Jake had been riding for 3 days straight, delivering cattle to a ranch near El Paso, and his weathered face showed the exhaustion of a man who lived his life in the saddle. His horse, a sturdy brown mare named Belle, picked her way carefully along the rocky riverbank. The sound of rushing water provided a peaceful backdrop to what had been days of dust, heat, and the constant lowing of cattle. Jake pulled his hat down low to shield his eyes from the brightening sun and took a long drink from his canteen. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was wet, and that was all that mattered out here. Jake Morrison wasn't like the other cowboys who worked the ranches. At 32, he was older than most, and he had a reputation for being fair and honest in his dealings. He'd grown up on a small farm in Missouri before the war changed everything. When he returned from fighting for the Union, his family's land had been sold for taxes, and he found himself with nothing but the clothes on his back and a horse that had carried him through battle. The frontier called to men like Jake. It promised freedom, adventure, and the chance to make something of yourself if you were willing, to work hard and take risks. He'd been working cattle drives and ranch jobs for over a decade now, saving every penny he could. His dream was to own his own spread someday, maybe find a good woman to share it with, but those dreams seemed as distant as the mountains on the horizon. As Belle picked her way around a bend in the river, Jake noticed something unusual. The usual sounds of the wilderness seemed muted here. Birds weren't singing, and even the insects seemed quieter. His trained eye scanned the landscape automatically, looking for signs of danger. In this part of Texas, you never knew when you might encounter bandits, hostile Apache, or wild animals. The Apache had been particularly active in recent months. The army was trying to round them up and force them onto reservations, but many bands refused to go. They continued to live as their ancestors had, moving freely across the land that had been theirs for generations. Jake had encountered Apache before, and while some meetings had been tense, he'd always managed to avoid serious trouble. He spoke a little of their language and showed respect for their ways, which had served him well. As he rode deeper into a secluded section of the riverbank, Jake began to hear something that made him slow Belle to a walk. It was the sound of splashing water, but not the natural rushing of the river. This was different, rhythmic, like someone was bathing or washing clothes. He knew he should probably turn around and find another route, but curiosity got the better of him. Jake had always been the kind of man who investigated unusual things. It was both a strength and a weakness. This trait had saved his life more than once when he'd discovered ambushes or dangerous animals before they could harm him. But it had also gotten him into trouble when his curiosity led him into situations he should have avoided. He dismounted Belle and tied her reins to a sturdy mesquite bush, then crept forward on foot. The sound of splashing grew louder, accompanied now by soft voices speaking in what sounded like Apache. Jake's heart began to beat faster. He knew he was probably making a mistake, but something compelled him to see what was happening. Moving, as quietly as his boots would allow on the rocky ground, Jake made his way through the thick brush that lined this section of the river. The vegetation was denser here, fed by the constant moisture from the water. Cottonwood trees provided shade, and their leaves rustled softly in the morning breeze. As he pushed through a final screen of willows, Jake found himself looking down into a natural pool formed by a bend in the river. The sight that met his eyes made him freeze in place. 3 Apache women were bathing in the clear water, their long black hair flowing around their shoulders as they moved gracefully in the current. Jake knew he should leave immediately. This was a private moment, and his presence here would be seen as a serious violation if he were discovered. Apache warriors did not take kindly to strangers who spied on their women, and the punishment for such an act could be severe. But something about the peaceful scene held him transfixed. The women appeared to be young, probably in their 20s, and they moved with the natural grace that Jake had noticed in Apache people. They were laughing softly as they bathed, clearly feeling safe in this secluded spot. One of them had a small child with her, a little girl who splashed happily in the shallow water near the bank. Jake realized he was holding his breath and forced himself to breathe normally. His mind raced as he tried to decide what to do. Every instinct told him to back away quietly and continue on his journey. But another part of him was fascinated by this glimpse into a world he rarely saw. The Apache people he usually encountered were warriors or traders, and they were always on guard around white men. Seeing these women in their natural state, relaxed and happy, gave him a different perspective on the Apache way of life. They weren't the savage warriors that newspaper stories made them out to be. They were people with families, People who laughed and played and enjoyed simple pleasures like bathing in a cool river on a hot morning. One of the women suddenly looked up, as if sensing something. Jake's heart pounded as her dark eyes seemed to scan the brush where he was hidden. He pressed himself closer to the ground, hardly daring to breathe. The woman said something to her companions, and they all became more alert, looking around nervously. Jake knew that Apache people had incredibly sharp senses, honed by generations of life in the wilderness. If they suspected someone was watching them, they would either flee immediately or call for help from their menfolk who were probably not far away. Either way, Jake's situation was becoming more dangerous by the minute. As he lay there in the brush trying to decide whether to reveal himself or attempt to sneak away, Jake Morrison had no idea that this chance encounter would change the course of his life forever. The peaceful morning by the river was about to become something much more complicated, and the simple cowboy who had stumbled upon this scene would soon find himself caught up in events that would test everything he believed about right and wrong, about the people he'd been taught to fear, and about his own heart. The Apache warriors who emerged from the brush were unlike any Jake had encountered before. There were 5 of them, all young and lean, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from living their entire lives in harmony with the harsh desert landscape. Their leader was a man who appeared to be in his early 30s with intelligent dark eyes and traditional Apache clothing that showed he held some position of authority within his band. Jake kept his hands visible and tried to maintain a calm demeanor as the warriors surrounded him. He could see that they were evaluating him, taking note of his weapons, his horse, and most importantly, his behavior. Any sudden movement or sign of aggression would probably result in immediate violence, and Jake had no desire to test the legendary fighting skills of Apache warriors. Ayanna spoke rapidly to the leader in Apache, explaining what had happened. Jake caught a few words here and there, enough to understand that she was telling them about how she had discovered him watching them bathe, but also that he had revealed himself voluntarily and seemed to mean no harm. The warrior leader listened, carefully, his dark eyes never leaving Jake's face. When Ayanna finished her explanation, the leader stepped forward and addressed Jake directly in surprisingly good English. "I am Nalnish," he said. "These women are under my protection. You have violated Apache law by watching them without permission. The penalty for this could be severe." Jake nodded respectfully. "I understand," he said. "I made a mistake and I'm willing to accept the consequences. But I want you to know that I meant no disrespect. I heard the water and thought it might be animals. When I realized what it was, I should have left immediately." Nalnish studied Jake's face for a long moment. "You speak some of our language," he observed. "Where did you learn this?" "From traders and other Apache people I've met over the years," Jake replied honestly. "I've always tried to be respectful of your ways. Today I failed in that respect, and I'm sorry." One of the other warriors said something in Apache that sounded angry, and Jake saw Nalnish raise a hand to quiet him. There was clearly some debate among the group about what to do with their unexpected captive. Jake realized that his fate was being decided by people who had every reason to see him as an enemy. The relationship between Apache bands and white settlers had been deteriorating for years. The government was pushing harder to force all Apache onto reservations, and there had been increasing incidents of violence on both sides. Warriors like these had probably lost friends and family members to white soldiers and settlers, just as many white families had lost loved ones to Apache raids. Nalnish made a decision. "You will come with us to our camp," he announced. "Our chief will decide what justice should be done. If you try to escape or cause trouble, you will be killed immediately." Jake nodded his agreement. He really had no choice in the matter, and he sensed that cooperation was his best chance for survival. "What about my horse?" he asked. "Bring her," Nalnish replied. "She will be cared for." Jake walked back through the brush to where Belle was tethered, very aware that several Apache warriors were following his every move. He untied the mare and led her back to the group, where Nalnish gestured for him to mount up. The warriors retrieved their own horses from where they had left them hidden in the brush, and soon the entire group was moving away from the river. As they rode, Jake found himself next to Ayanna, who was mounted on a beautiful pinto pony. The little girl, who he learned was called Ciala and was Kachina's daughter, rode with her mother behind them. Despite the circumstances, Jake couldn't help but admire the way the Apache people moved across the landscape. They seemed to be part of the desert itself, reading signs in the rocks and vegetation that were invisible to his eyes. "Your English is very good," Jake ventured to say to Ayana as they rode. She glanced at him with what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I lived at mission school for 3 years when I was young," she explained, "before my people came to take me home." Jake was surprised by this information. He had heard of Apache children being sent to mission schools, where they were supposed to learn white ways and become civilized. Most of these children were eventually returned to their families, but the experience usually left them able to move between both worlds. "Did you like the school?" Jake asked carefully. Ayana was quiet for so long that Jake thought she wasn't going to answer. Finally, she said, "I learned useful things. Language, reading, some white customs. But it was not home. When my brother came for me, I was happy to leave." Jake noticed that one of the warriors riding ahead of them kept looking back with obvious disapproval. Nalnish seemed to notice this too, because he rode back and said something sharp in Apache that made the warrior turn around and focus on the trail ahead. "Taze does not approve of talking with white men," Ayana explained quietly. "He has lost family to white soldiers." Jake nodded, understanding the man's hostility. "I'm sorry for his losses," he said, and meant it. The violence between Apache and white settlers had created grief and anger on both sides, and Jake had seen enough of it to know that hatred only bred more hatred. They rode for several hours through increasingly rugged terrain. Jake was impressed by the skill with which his captors navigated the rocky landscape, following trails that he would never have noticed. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the heat became oppressive, but the Apache seemed unaffected by it. Finally, they crested a ridge and Jake got his first look at the Apache camp below. It was located in a hidden valley with good water and natural shelter, the kind of place that could be defended easily, but was nearly invisible from the surrounding hills. There were perhaps 20 families living there, their traditional wickiups scattered among the trees near a clear stream. As the group descended into the camp, Jake could see people coming out of their homes to watch their arrival. Children ran, alongside their horses, chattering excitedly in Apache. The adults were more reserved, studying Jake with expressions that ranged from curiosity to open hostility. Jake realized that many of these people had probably never seen a white man up close, except perhaps during violent encounters. Nalnish led them to the center of the camp, where an older man emerged from the largest wickiup. Even before anyone spoke, Jake could tell that this was the chief. He carried himself with the kind of natural authority that comes from years of making decisions that affect the survival of his people. His hair was streaked with gray, and his weathered face showed the wisdom that comes from surviving in one of the harshest environments in North America. The chief's name was Cochise, though Jake learned later that this was not the famous chief of the same name, but a younger man who had taken the honored name. Nalnish dismounted and approached the chief, speaking rapidly in Apache while gesturing toward Jake. The chief listened without expression, his dark eyes studying Jake intently. When Nalnish finished his report, Chief Cochise stepped forward and addressed Jake directly. His English was accented but clear. "You are Jake Morrison," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Jake replied, dismounting from Bell and standing respectfully before the chief. "You have seen our women at their bathing place," Cochise continued. "This is a serious violation of our customs. Some of my warriors believe you should be punished severely for this offense." Jake could feel the tension in the camp as people waited to hear how their chief would handle this situation. He sensed that his response to these next few moments would determine whether he lived or died, and possibly whether this encounter led to more violence between Apache and white people in the region. "I understand that I have caused offense," Jake said carefully. "It was not my intention, but that doesn't excuse my actions. I'm prepared to accept whatever punishment you think is fair." Chief Cochise studied Jake's face for a long moment, and Jake had the uncomfortable feeling that the Apache leader could see right into his soul. Finally, the chief spoke again. "We will hold council tonight to discuss your fate," he announced. "Until then, you will be our guest. Ayanna will be responsible for you." Being assigned to Ayanna's care was both a relief and a source of anxiety for Jake. On one hand, it meant he wasn't being thrown into a hole or tied up like a prisoner. On the other hand, it put him in close contact with the very woman whose privacy he had violated, which made his shame about the morning's events even more acute. Ayanna led him to a small wiki-up on the edge of the camp, explaining that it was normally used for guests or young unmarried men. "You will stay here until the council decides," she said matter-of-factly. "There will be guards, but they are for your protection as much as to watch you. Some people here have strong feelings about white men." Jake nodded, understanding the war situation. "I appreciate your kindness," he said. "I know I don't deserve it." Ayanna looked at him thoughtfully. "You revealed yourself when you could have tried to escape," she said. "That shows honor, even if your first action did not." As the day progressed, Jake found himself experiencing Apache life from the inside in a way that few white men ever had. Children who had been initially fearful became curious, creeping closer to stare at his pale skin and different clothes. Some of the women brought him food and water, though they maintained a respectful distance. The men were more reserved, watching him with careful eyes but not showing open hostility. Ayanna proved to be an excellent guide to understanding what was happening around him. She explained the daily routines of the camp, the relationships between different families, and the customs that governed Apache life. Jake was surprised by how organized and peaceful the community was. The violent savages described in newspaper stories bore little resemblance to these people, who clearly valued family, tradition, and harmony with their environment. "Tell me about your life before today," Ayanna said, as they sat in the shade near his temporary home. "What made you become a cowboy?" Jake found himself opening up to her in a way that surprised him. He told her about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about losing his family's land while he was away fighting in the war, and about his dreams of someday owning his own ranch. He talked about the loneliness of life on the trail, the friends he had made and lost, and the constant search for belonging that had driven him west. "You have no family?" Ayanna asked. "None left," Jake replied. "My parents died while I was at war, and my sister married and moved to California. I haven't seen her in years." Ayanna was quiet for a moment, then said, "Apache people believe that family is everything. A person without family is like a tree without roots. Perhaps that is why you wander." Her words struck Jake as profoundly true. He had been drifting from job to job, ranch to ranch for years without ever really settling anywhere. He had told himself it was because he hadn't found the right opportunity, but maybe it was really because he had no anchor, no people who depended on him or whom he could depend on. As the afternoon wore on, Jake began to notice the preparations for the evening council. The camp's atmosphere grew more serious, and he could see groups of men gathering to discuss his situation. Some of the conversations looked heated, and Jake realized that his fate was far from certain. "What will happen at the council?" he asked Ayanna. "The men will speak about what should be done," she explained. "Some will want harsh punishment to send a message to other white men. Others may argue for mercy, especially since you showed honor by revealing yourself. The chief will listen to all voices, but the final decision will be his. And if he decides on harsh punishment," Ayanna met his eyes directly, "then you will face it with courage, as a man should." As evening approached, Jake was summoned to the center of the camp where a fire had been built and the adult members of the band had gathered in a circle. Chief Cochise sat in the place of honor, with the other senior men arranged around him according to their status within the group. The women sat separately, but Jake noticed that their presence indicated they would have some voice in the proceedings. Jake was directed to sit in the center of the circle, where everyone could see him. The feeling of being the focus of so much attention was overwhelming, especially when he considered that these people were deciding whether he would live or die. He tried to maintain a calm, respectful demeanor, remembering that any sign of fear or disrespect could influence the decision against him. Chief Cochise began the council by explaining the situation to the assembled people. He spoke in Apache, but Jake could follow enough of it to understand that he was giving a fair and accurate account of the day's events. When the chief finished, he invited others to speak. The first to rise was Taze, the warrior who had shown hostility toward Jake earlier in the day. His speech was passionate and angry, and even without understanding all the words, Jake could tell that he was arguing for severe punishment. Other men nodded as Taze spoke, and Jake's heart sank as he realized that a significant portion of the group supported this position. When Taze finished, Nalnish stood to speak. His words were more measured, and Jake gathered that he was presenting a more moderate position. He seemed to be arguing that while Jake's offense was serious, his behavior after being discovered showed that he was not entirely without honor. Several other men spoke, some supporting harsh punishment, others advocating for a more lenient approach. The debate went on for over an hour, with the passion of the speakers making it clear that this decision was about much more than just Jake's individual fate. It was about how the Apache people should respond to the increasing encroachment of white civilization on their traditional lands and ways of life. Finally, Chief Cochise called for Ayana to speak. Jake was surprised when she rose and walked to the center of the circle. He hadn't realized that women were allowed to address the council on such matters, but everyone listened respectfully as she began to speak. Ayana's speech was brief but eloquent. Although she spoke in Apache, Jake could tell from her tone and gestures that she was speaking on his behalf. She seemed to be emphasizing his willingness to reveal himself and accept responsibility for his actions, and she appeared to be making some kind of personal request to the chief. When Ayana finished speaking and returned to her place, Chief Cochise stood and began his own address to the council. This was clearly the moment when the decision would be announced, and Jake could feel his heart pounding as he waited to learn his fate. The chief spoke for several minutes, his words carrying the authority of his position and the wisdom of his years. Jake caught enough to understand that he was weighing the various arguments that had been presented, considering both the need to uphold Apache law and the unique circumstances of this particular case. Finally, Chief Cochise turned to Jake and spoke in English so that there would be no misunderstanding of his decision. "Jake Morrison," he said solemnly, "you have committed an offense against our people and our customs. The traditional punishment for this crime would be severe, possibly death. However, the council has heard testimony that you showed honor by revealing yourself when you could have escaped, and that you have shown respect for our people in your past dealings with Apache bands." Jake held his breath, waiting for the verdict. "Therefore," the chief continued, "the council has decided that you will make amends for your offense by serving our people. You will remain with us for one full cycle of the moon, during which time you will work for the good of our community. You will help with hunting, with caring for our animals, and with any other tasks that need to be done. At the end of this time, if you have proven yourself to be a man of honor, you will be free to go." Jake felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had escaped death or severe physical punishment, but a month among the Apache would be unlike anything he had ever experienced. He would be completely dependent on the goodwill of people who had every reason to distrust him, living in a culture he only partially understood. "Do you accept this judgment?" Chief Cochise asked. Jake stood and faced the chief respectfully. "I accept," he said firmly. "I'm grateful for your mercy, and I'll do my best to prove worthy of it." The council dispersed soon after, with people returning to their evening routines. As Jake walked back to his temporary home, he found Ayana walking beside him. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I could tell you spoke for me." "I told them that you have kind eyes," she replied, "and that sometimes good people make mistakes without meaning harm." As they reached his wickiup, Jake realized that his life had just taken a turn he never could have anticipated. A month ago, he had been just another cowboy drifting across the frontier. Now he was about to spend the next month living as a member of an Apache band, learning their ways and trying to prove that he was worthy of their trust. It would be the beginning of the most transformative period of his life. The first week of Jake's sentence was the most difficult period of his life. Everything he thought he knew about survival and living in the wilderness was challenged by the Apache way of doing things. The band lived so lightly on the land that they seemed to leave almost no trace of their presence. Yet they managed to thrive in a desert environment that would have killed most white men within days. Nalnish had been assigned to oversee Jake's work and education during his time with the band. The Apache warrior was a patient but demanding teacher, showing Jake how to track animals by reading signs that were invisible to untrained eyes, how to find water in places where none seemed to exist, and how to move through the desert without making noise or leaving obvious trails. White men crash through the wilderness like wounded buffalo, Nalnish observed on Jake's third day as they returned from a hunting trip. They see only what is directly in front of them and miss the stories that the land tells. Jake was learning to read those stories, though slowly and with frequent mistakes. He was beginning to understand how the Apache could survive and even flourish in country that seemed barren and lifeless to outsiders. Every plant, every rock formation, every change in the wind carried information for those who knew how to interpret it. The physical demands of Apache life were also challenging. Jake thought he was in good shape from his years of ranch work, but keeping up with Apache warriors on long hunts tested his endurance in new ways. The men could run for miles across rough terrain without seeming to tire, and they could go without water longer than Jake had thought possible. But it wasn't just the physical challenges that made the adjustment difficult. Jake was struggling to understand the complex social relationships within the band and his place in them. As an outsider serving a sentence for wrongdoing, he occupied an unusual position that had no clear precedent in Apache society. Some members of the band, particularly the older warriors, remained suspicious of him despite the chief's decision. They watched his every move, waiting for him to do something that would confirm their belief that white men could not be trusted. Others, especially the women and children, began to warm to him as they saw that he was making a genuine effort to be helpful and respectful. Ayanna continued to serve as his primary guide to understanding Apache customs and expectations. She had a gift for explaining complex cultural concepts in ways that Jake could grasp, and her presence helped legitimize his position within the community. Other women began to follow her lead in treating him with cautious friendliness rather than outright hostility. "You are learning," she observed one evening as they sat by the fire after a day spent helping the women process acorns into flour. "But you still think like a white man sometimes." Jake looked at her questioningly. "What do you mean?" "You see tasks that need to be done, and you do them efficiently," she explained. "But you don't yet understand the relationships behind the tasks. Apache work is not just about getting things finished. It's about strengthening the bonds between people, sharing knowledge, maintaining harmony within the group." This was a revelation for Jake. In his previous life, work had been mostly about individual achievement and personal survival. The idea that the process of working together was as important as the results being achieved was foreign to him, but he began to see examples of it everywhere in Apache life. When the men went hunting, for instance, the actual killing of game was less important than the way the hunters shared information, supported each other, and maintained their relationships as warriors. When the women worked together, processing food or making tools, they were also sharing stories, teaching children, and reinforcing the social fabric of the community. Jake's understanding deepened during his second week when he was invited to participate in a ceremony for a young man who was reaching adulthood. The ritual was complex and meaningful, involving the entire community and acknowledging the boy's transition from childhood to warrior status. Jake was moved by the solemnity and beauty of the ceremony, and by the obvious care and pride that the community invested in each of its members. "In your world," Ayanna explained to him afterward, "people often face important moments alone. Here we believe that every person's journey affects the whole band, so we share both the burdens and the celebrations." As Jake's Apache language skills improved and he became more comfortable with the band's routines, he began to contribute more meaningfully to daily life. He proved to be skilled at caring for the horses, drawing on his years of experience with livestock. He also helped with construction and maintenance of the wiki-ups, and his knowledge of white customs and technology occasionally proved useful. But it was during a hunting expedition in his third week that Jake truly proved his worth to the band. The hunters had been tracking a small herd of deer for 2 days when they encountered a group of white soldiers who were obviously lost and in serious trouble. The soldiers were out of water, exhausted, and clearly on the verge of making desperate decisions that could lead to violence. The Apache warriors wanted to avoid the soldiers entirely, as contact with the army rarely ended well for their people. But Jake convinced them that these particular men posed no threat and might actually become allies if they were helped, rather than left to die in the desert. "Let me talk to them," Jake suggested to Nalnish. "They're scared and desperate, but they're not looking for a fight. If we help them now, maybe they'll remember that not all Apache are enemies." It was a risky decision, but Chief Cookies ultimately agreed to let Jake attempt to mediate the encounter. Jake approached the soldiers alone, his hands visible and his manner clearly peaceful. The soldiers were indeed desperate enough to welcome help from any source, even a white man who appeared to be traveling with Apache. Jake was able to convince the soldiers that the Apache were willing to guide them to water and back to the main trail, asking only that they remember this kindness and speak truthfully about it when they returned to their post. The soldiers, grateful to be saved from almost certain death, readily agreed. The encounter went smoothly, with the Apache providing water and direction to the lost soldiers, who departed expressing genuine gratitude for the assistance they had received. It was a small victory for understanding between the two cultures, and Jake could see that his role in facilitating it had raised his standing within the band considerably. "You have shown wisdom today," Chief Cochise told him that evening. "Perhaps there are some white men who can learn to see beyond their own fears and prejudices." But Jake's growing acceptance within the band was creating complications he hadn't anticipated. His relationship with Ayana had evolved from that of prisoner and guard to something much more complex and meaningful. They spent increasing amounts of time together, and Jake found himself drawn to her intelligence, strength, and gentle humor in ways that went far beyond gratitude for her kindness. The problem was that Jake knew his time with the Apache was temporary. In just one more week he would be free to leave and return to his old life. But the prospect of leaving was becoming increasingly painful, not just because he was learning to love Apache ways of life, but because he was falling in love with Ayana. He could tell that she was struggling with similar feelings. Their conversations had become more personal and intimate, and there were moments when he caught her looking at him with an expression that went far beyond friendly concern. But they both knew that any relationship between them would face enormous obstacles. "What will you do when your time here is finished?" she asked him one evening as they walked along the stream that provided water for the camp. Jake had been dreading this question because he didn't have a good answer. "I don't know," he admitted. "A month ago I would have said I'd go back to my old life, maybe find a ranch job somewhere. But now you have seen a different way of living," Ayana finished for him. "And perhaps you are not sure the old way will satisfy you anymore." That was exactly right. Jake had discovered that there were forms of wealth that had nothing to do with money, kinds of security that came from community rather than individual strength, and sources of meaning that he had never encountered in the white world. The idea of returning to his solitary life as a drifting cowboy held little appeal. But staying with the Apache would mean giving up everything he had ever known, and embracing a life that most white people would consider a betrayal of his own race. It would mean living as a permanent outsider in a culture that, despite its kindness to him, he would never fully belong to. And it would mean building a relationship with Ayana in a world where such relationships were complicated by the ongoing conflict between their peoples. As his final week with the band began, Jake realized that the decision he was facing would determine not just his immediate future, but the entire course of his life. He had entered the Apache camp as a prisoner paying penance for his mistakes. He would leave it as a man fundamentally changed by everything he had learned about himself, about other people, and about what it means to truly belong somewhere. The question was whether he would have the courage to act on that knowledge. The final week of Jake's sentence arrived with the changing of the desert seasons. The intense heat of summer was beginning to give way to the cooler days of autumn, and the Apache were making preparations for their traditional migration to winter, camps in the protected canyons to the south. The timing of these preparations served as a constant reminder that Jake's time with the band was coming to an end. During his last few days, Jake threw himself into helping with the preparations for the move. He worked alongside the men in repairing weapons and tools, helped the women preserve meat and prepare foods for travel, and spent hours with the children, teaching them some of the English words he had learned while picking up more Apache vocabulary from them. But his most meaningful moments continued to be those spent with Ayanna. They had developed a routine of walking together in the evenings, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying each other's company in comfortable silence. These walks had become precious to both of them, representing a kind of peace and connection that neither had experienced before. On the second-to-last evening of his stay, as they sat by the stream watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Ayanna finally addressed the question that had been hanging between them for weeks. "What is in your heart, Jake Morrison?" she asked quietly. "When you leave us tomorrow, will you return to your old life and forget what you have learned here?" Jake had been wrestling with this question constantly, and he still didn't have a clear answer. "I could never forget this place or these people," he said honestly. "You've all taught me things about living that I never knew before. But I don't know if I'm strong enough to completely change my life." Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Change is not something that happens all at once like lightning. Sometimes it is like the river, slowly wearing new channels through rock that seemed permanent." Her words made Jake think about the gradual transformation he had undergone during his month with the Apache. When he had first arrived, he had been focused solely on surviving his punishment and getting back to his normal life. But gradually, almost without realizing it, he had begun to adopt Apache ways of thinking and being in the world. "What about you?" Jake asked. "What's in your heart?" Ayanna looked at him with an expression that was both tender and sad. "My heart tells me that some people come into our lives like shooting stars, bright and beautiful but not meant to stay. Others are like the North Star, constant and reliable, helping us find our way through dark times." "Which am I?" Jake asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. "I thought you were a shooting star," she replied. "But now I think maybe you could be something more if you choose to be." The weight of her words settled on Jake like a physical burden. She was telling him that she had feelings for him, but she was also acknowledging that any future between them depended on choices he would have to make about who he wanted to be and how he wanted to live. That night, Jake lay awake in his wiki-up, staring at the stars and thinking about the life he had built for himself before stumbling into the Apache camp. It had been a life of freedom and independence, but also of loneliness and constant movement. He had told himself that he was searching for the right opportunity, the perfect ranch, the ideal situation that would allow him to settle down. But now he wondered if what he had really been searching for was a sense of belonging and purpose that no individual achievement could provide. The Apache had shown him a different way of being in the world, one based on connection to community and land rather than individual advancement. They had demonstrated that true security came not from accumulating possessions, but from maintaining relationships with people who would support you through both good times and bad. Morning came too, quickly, bringing with it the formal ceremony that would mark the end of Jake's sentence. Chief Cochise called the entire band together to acknowledge Jake's completion of his service and to send him on his way with the community's blessing. "Jake Morrison," the chief said formally, "you came to us as one who had committed an offense against our people. You leave us as one who has shown honor and earned our respect. You are no longer our prisoner, but neither are you our enemy. You will always be welcome to return to this place if your heart calls you back." The chief's words were echoed by others in the band, including some of the warriors who had initially viewed Jake with suspicion. Nalnish presented him with a beautifully crafted knife as a token of friendship, and several families gave him small gifts to remember them by. But it was Ayanna's goodbye that affected him most deeply. She walked with him to the edge of the camp where Belle was waiting, saddled and ready for the journey back to the white world. "I have something for you," she said, pulling a small leather pouch from around her neck. "It contains sage and sweetgrass from this place, and a small stone from the stream where we walked together. When you are far away and wondering about the choices you have made, hold these things and remember that there are people here who will always consider you family." Jake took the pouch and hung it around his own neck, feeling the weight of it against his chest. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for me," he said. You saved my life that first day, and then you helped save my soul during all the days that followed." Tears glistened in Ayana's eyes, but her voice was steady. "You saved yourself, Jake Morrison. I only helped you see what was already in your heart." As Jake mounted Bell and prepared to ride away from the Apache camp, he felt as though he were being torn in half. Part of him wanted to stay, to ask Chief Cochise if he could remain permanently with the band and build a life among these people who had shown him such kindness. But another part of him was afraid of making such a dramatic change, afraid of abandoning everything familiar for an uncertain future in a world where he would always be an outsider. He rode slowly up the trail that led out of the hidden valley, looking back repeatedly at the camp and the people who had become so important to him. At the top of the ridge, he stopped for one last look at the place that had changed his life so completely. As he sat there on Bell, torn between two worlds and two possible futures, Jake realized that Ayana had been right about change being like a river rather than lightning. The transformation that had begun during his month with the Apache was not complete, and it would continue to work on him regardless of which path he chose. 6 months later, Jake Morrison returned to the hidden valley, not as a prisoner or a visitor, but as a man who had finally understood what it meant to come home. He brought with him the proceeds from selling everything he owned in the white world, along with supplies and gifts for the people who had taught him that true wealth had nothing to do with money and everything to do with love, community, and belonging. Ayana was waiting for him at the edge of the camp, as if she had known that this day would come. "The North Star returns," she said with a smile that lit up her entire face. "I told you I might be something more than a shooting star," Jake replied, dismounting from Bell and walking toward the woman who had helped him discover who he was meant to be. Their embrace sealed a choice that would shape the rest of both their lives. A choice that transformed a chance encounter by a river into a love story that would be told around Apache fires for generations to come. Jake Morrison had finally found his home. Not in a place, but in the arms of a people who had seen past his mistakes to the good man he was capable of becoming. And in the hidden valley where a stream ran clear and constant, two worlds became one. In the joining of two hearts that had been meant for each other from the moment a curious cowboy had spotted 3 Apache women bathing in the morning sun,